The steel chair had no padding, which was the first thing I noticed when they brought me in. Cold metal against my spine, the kind of cold that seeps through fabric and settles in your bones. The interrogation chamber stretched before me like a cathedral of questions, high-vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows. Walls lined with scrolls and parchments bearing the Aquila, and banks of cogitators humming their mechanical prayers. The air tasted of incense and ozone, sweet, sacred smoke mixing with the bitter tang of electrical discharge. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, echoing off the stone despite my efforts to control it. They had stripped away my administratum robes 3 days ago, leaving me in the rough brown cloth of a penitent, the fabric scratched against skin still tender from the manacles, and I found myself cataloguing each sensation as if documenting evidence for some impossible appeal. The scratch of wool, the throb of circulation returning to my wrists, the metallic taste coating my tongue that I couldn't identify but suspected was fear given physical form. The interrogator entered without fanfare, her boots clicking a steady rhythm against the marble floor. She was younger than I expected, perhaps 30 Terran years, with the pale complexion of someone who lived permanently in artificial light. Her uniform bore the crimson sash of her office, and suspended from her belt were instruments I tried not to examine too closely. When she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Data Scribe Matthias Helm, Administratum Division 7. 7 Alpha. Subsector Clerical Operations. She read from a data slate without looking at me. 32 years of faithful service, commendations for efficiency. Never missed a tithe calculation. Never filed a false report. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, pale grey like winter ice. Never, that is, until 17 days ago. The words hung in the air between us like an accusation made manifest. I wanted to protest, to explain about the discrepancies I'd found, about the missing shipments and the numbers that refused to balance no matter how many times I checked them, but my throat felt lined with parchment, dry and rough, and I could only nod. You discovered something in the freight manifests, she continued, settling into the chair across from me with deliberate precision. Something that made you violate 17 separate protocols regarding data security, interdepartmental communication, and chain of command reporting. Something so significant that you felt compelled to encrypt files, schedule unauthorized meetings, and send coded messages through civilian Vox networks. The scratching started then, soft and rhythmic, like a stylus against parchment. I turned my head, searching for the source, but saw only empty walls and flickering lumen strips. The interrogator's expression didn't change, as if the sound was perfectly normal, or perhaps didn't exist at all. I was trying to follow proper channels. I managed, my voice cracking slightly. The discrepancies were significant. 17 million tons of processed ore, missing from the shipping records but still logged as delivered. Someone needed to know. Someone. She leaned forward, fingers steepled. You sent a message to Magos Therian Vex on Forge World Metallos. A message containing classified shipping data, production quotas, and orbital dock assignments. Information that, in the wrong hands, could compromise entire supply lines. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like claws on metal. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead, despite the chamber's chill. The Magos oversees ore processing for the entire subsector. If there was corruption in the supply chain, corruption. The word left her lips like a physical thing, heavy with implication. An interesting choice of words. Tell me, Data Scribe, what do you know about the Hereticus Majoris? My blood turned to ice water. The Hereticus Majoris, the classification reserved for the most dangerous forms of heretical activity, industrial sabotage, sedition, chaos, corruption, the kind of charges that ended with summary execution if you were fortunate, or servitor conversion if you were not. Nothing, I whispered. I know nothing about any heresy. I was just trying to account for missing ore shipments, numbers that didn't add up. It's what I do, it's all I've ever done. Check the manifests, balance the ledgers, ensure everything matches. The interrogator made a note on her data slate, the stylus scratching against its surface with the same rhythm I'd been hearing since I entered the chamber. The realization sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the metal chair. "The missing ore you discovered," she said, still writing, "was bound for the Cadian Gate. 17 million tons of high-grade adamantine, processed and ready for transport to the fortress worlds. Ore that never arrived at its destination because someone or something intercepted the shipments before they left system." I stared at her, the implications crashing over me like waves against a seawall. The Cadian Gate, the most heavily fortified region of Imperial space, where the forces of the Imperium held back the ever-pressing darkness of the Eye of Terror. Adamantine meant for bunkers, weapons, vehicle armor, material that could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe for countless guardsmen. "You think I began, but she cut me off with a raised hand. "I think you stumbled onto something much larger than missing ore shipments," she said. "Your message to Magos Vex was intercepted by our astropathic monitors. Standard procedure for all intersector communications. What we found in the encrypted portions was illuminating." She activated a cogitator terminal built into her side of the table, and hololithic displays flickered to life in the air between us. Shipping records, manifest data, transport schedules, all information I recognized from my own investigation. But overlaid across the familiar numbers were new annotations, red text that made my stomach clench with dread. 17 separate ore shipments diverted to coordinates outside Imperial space. She read from the display. Cargo transferred to vessels bearing unknown identification codes. Ships that subsequently vanished from all tracking systems. Her pale eyes fixed on me again. Ships whose sensor signatures match those of known Chaos Raider fleets. The scratching sound intensified, accompanied now by a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the chamber walls. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the sound came from inside my skull, rhythmic and insistent, like a heartbeat made of steel. "I didn't know," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "How could I know? I just saw discrepancies in the shipping logs. Numbers that didn't balance. It's my job to report irregularities, to make sure the tithes are accurate." I was following standard protocol for accounting anomalies. Standard protocol. She leaned back in her chair, studying me like a biologist examining a specimen. Standard protocol would have been to report the discrepancies to your immediate supervisor, Data Marshal Corvain. Instead, you bypassed 17 levels of command authority and sent classified information directly to a Magos on another world. Why? The question hung in the air like a sword blade. I could feel moisture beading on my palms, could taste copper and ozone growing stronger with each breath. The truth was simple, mundane even, but in the context of this chamber it felt like a confession of the worst kind. "Corvain was involved," I whispered. "His authorization codes were on half the diverted shipments. His personal seal authenticated the transport modifications. If I'd gone to him with the discrepancies..." "You believed your immediate superior was complicit in heretical activity," the interrogator said, making another note. "Yet you made no attempt to contact the local Arbites, the planetary governor's office, or any other Imperial authority. Instead, you reached out to a tech priest on a forge world, a being whose loyalties and motivations are notoriously difficult to determine." The humming grew louder, joined by what sounded like whispered voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. I gripped the arms of the chair, metal slick under my sweating palms, and tried to focus on the interrogator's questions, but the sounds were building, layering over each other like a choir of the damned. "Magos Vex had worked with our division before," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the phantom chorus. "Quality assessments, purity certifications for ore shipments. He seemed trustworthy, logical. I thought he could help verify whether the missing materials were actually reaching their intended destinations." "And what did the Magos tell you, Data Scribe Helm?" The question cut through the growing cacophony like a blade through silk. For a moment, The chamber fell silent, except for the distant hum of machinery and the sound of my own labored breathing. I looked at the interrogator's pale face, at the patient expectation in her grey eyes, and realized that this moment had been inevitable from the instant I'd first noticed the discrepancies in the shipping logs. "He told me to run." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I watched as Interrogator Vex processed this revelation, her expression shifting through several micro-emotions before settling into something that might have been satisfaction. The servo skull hovering above her shoulder whirred softly, recording every syllable, every inflection of my voice. "Run," she repeated, savoring the word. "And did you follow the Magus's counsel, Data Scribe Helm?" I swallowed hard, my throat feeling like parchment. "No, Interrogator. I couldn't. The data was wrong. Someone was falsifying records, and I had to know who, had to know why, had to know." Vex leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "Not wanted to know. Had to. Tell me about this compulsion of yours, Data Scribe. When did you first realize that your curiosity might be more than mere intellectual interest?" The question struck me like a physical blow. I'd been asking myself the same thing for weeks now, ever since I'd found myself crawling through maintenance shafts in the dead of night, following data cables like a bloodhound follows scent. When had my routine audit become an obsession? "I don't understand what you mean, Interrogator. Don't you?" Her voice carried a note of gentle disappointment, the kind a teacher might use with a particularly slow student. "You were a model citizen of the Imperium. 17 years of faithful service, commendations for accuracy and diligence, and then, overnight, you began exhibiting behavior patterns consistent with—" She paused, consulting a data slate that materialized from beneath her robes. "Heretical curiosity, unauthorized access to restricted files, consorting with known dissidents." "Dissidents?" The word came out as a croak. "I never." "Tech, Adept Zirian." The name hit me like a last bolt to the chest. "You met with him 14 times over the past month, always in unauthorized locations, always outside your normal duty hours." "Zirion." I closed my eyes, remembering his augmetic face, the way his optical implants had whirred when he'd shown me the hidden partition in the data core. The tech adept had been my only ally in unraveling the conspiracy, the only one who'd understood the significance of what we'd found. "He was helping me trace the falsified records," I said. "The shipping manifests were being altered at the source level, but someone was covering their tracks. Zirian had the technical expertise to commit tech heresy," Vex interrupted smoothly, "to violate the sanctity of machine spirits, to delve into forbidden knowledge." Her eyes glittered in the sickly light. "Did he tell you about his theories regarding the nature of the Omnissiah? About the alternative interpretations of the Codex Mechanicus?" My mouth went dry. Zirian had mentioned something during our last meeting, something about patterns in the data that suggested connections between seemingly unrelated systems across the sector. He'd started talking about larger implications, about how the falsified records might be part of something far more extensive than simple corruption or incompetence. But he'd stopped himself, claiming it was nothing, just the rambling of an old tech priest. "I see from your expression that he did." Vex made another notation. "And what did you make of these theories?" "They were just speculation," I said quickly. "Random thoughts. He never—" "Data Scribe Helm." The interrogator's voice cut through my denials with surgical precision. "I have been conducting interrogations for 37 years. I have broken hardened cultists and watched Chaos Space Marines weep like children. Do you really think you can lie to me about what you've seen? About what you know?" The certainty in her voice was terrifying, not because she was threatening me, but because she was right. I had seen something in those patterns, something that had kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my hab unit while my mind churned through the implications. The falsified records weren't random. They followed a pattern, a careful, deliberate arrangement that spoke of coordination across vast distances and time periods. "The shipping routes," I whispered. "Yes." Vex leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. "Tell me about the shipping routes." My hands were shaking now. I clasped them together in my lap, but I could still feel the tremor running through my entire body. They formed a pattern. The falsified records, when you plotted them across the sector map, they connected. Star systems that should have no relation to each other were suddenly linked by these phantom shipments. Resources being redirected, personnel transfers that made no sense according to official records. "And what did this pattern suggest to you?" I looked up at her, seeing not the pale, thin woman in inquisitorial robes, but something far more dangerous. She already knew, had probably known before I'd even been brought into this chamber. This wasn't an interrogation to gather information, it was a test. "A network," I said. "Someone or some group has been using the regular shipping lanes to move things. People, equipment, information. All hidden beneath layers of false documentation and bureaucratic camouflage. Very good." Vex made another mark on her data slate. "And did you share this insight with anyone other than Tech Adept Xerion?" The question was delivered in the same conversational tone, but I could hear the trap in it. If I said yes, I'd be implicating others. If I said no, I'd be admitting to keeping dangerous knowledge to myself. Either answer could be construed as heretical behavior. I tried to report it through proper channels," I said carefully. "But my supervisor, Magos Thane, told me to abandon the investigation." "Because he was part of the network?" The accusation hung in the air between us. Magos Thane, who'd been my mentor for the better part of a decade, who'd taught me the intricacies of data pattern analysis and the sacred protocols of information management. The thought that he might be involved in, whatever this was, felt like blasphemy. But as I sat there in that sterile chamber, with the interrogator's grey eyes boring into me, I found myself remembering things. Small inconsistencies in Thane's behavior over the past months, his quick dismissal of my concerns, the way he'd avoided certain questions about shipping protocols, his insistence that I drop the investigation entirely. "I don't know," I said finally. "I want to believe he was just trying to protect me from getting involved in something dangerous. But you suspect otherwise?" "Yes." Vex nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd already known. "Data Scribe Helm, I'm going to share something with you. Something that may help you understand the gravity of the situation you've stumbled into." She gestured to the servo skull, which descended to hover directly above the table between us. Its optical sensors whirred, and suddenly the air above the table shimmered with hololithic projection. I gasped despite myself. The image showed a three-dimensional map of our sector, but not as I'd ever seen it before. Instead of the usual territorial boundaries and shipping lanes, this map was overlaid with a web of connections, glowing lines that linked dozens of star systems in an intricate pattern. At key nexus points, pulsing red markers indicated locations of particular significance. "This," Vex said quietly, "is what your falsified shipping records are part of. A network that spans not just our sector, but reaches into at least 3 neighboring sectors as well. A network that has been operating for an estimated 47 years, moving personnel, equipment, and information with such subtlety that it has evaded detection by all but the most dedicated investigators." I stared at the hololithic display, my mind reeling. The pattern I'd discovered was just a tiny fragment of something vast and incomprehensible. What is it? What are they doing? We're not entirely certain yet, but we have strong evidence that this network has been facilitating the movement of heretical materials, possibly including chaos artifacts and corrupted individuals. The scope of their operations suggests coordination at the highest levels of both civilian and military authority. The implications hit me like a thunderbolt. If the network had been operating for nearly 5 decades, if it really did involve high-ranking officials, then the corruption ran deeper than anything I could have imagined. And I, in my naive determination to follow a simple audit trail, had stumbled into the middle of it. "Tech Adept Xerion," I said suddenly. "Is he?" "Dead." Vex's voice was matter-of-fact. Killed 3 days ago, along with his entire research team. Made to look like an accident, of course. A plasma conduit failure in their workshop. The news hit me like a physical blow. Zirian, with his patient explanations and his obvious excitement at our discoveries, was gone. Murdered because he'd helped me uncover the truth. They know, I whispered. They know I found the pattern. Yes, Vex agreed. Which is why you're here, under inquisitorial protection, rather than lying in a morgue next to your tech-adept friend. The weight of Zirian's death settled over me like a shroud. I'd barely known him for more than a few hours, but his enthusiasm for the work, his careful explanations of ancient technologies, it had reminded me why I'd become an archaeologist in the first place. Now he was dead because of my discovery. Tell me about the pattern, Vex said, his voice cutting through my grief. There was no gentleness in it, no acknowledgement of my loss, just cold, professional interest. I looked up at him, this man who claimed to be protecting me while simultaneously interrogating me. Why should I trust you? For all I know, you're the one who killed Zirian. If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead. He said it matter-of-factly, without boasting or threat. The Ordo Hereticus doesn't waste time with elaborate deceptions when a bolt round would suffice. How comforting. But despite my sarcasm, I found myself believing him. There was something about his directness that seemed genuine, even if everything else about this situation was terrifying. Vex pulled out a data slate and placed it on the table between us. The screen flickered to life, showing a three-dimensional map of the subsector. Red dots marked dozens of worlds, creating a pattern that made my breath catch. We've been tracking similar incidents across 17 systems, he said. Archaeological sites mysteriously destroyed. Research teams eliminated. Ancient artifacts disappearing from Imperial vaults. You're not the first to stumble onto something significant, but you may be the first to survive long enough to explain it. I studied the map, my archaeologist's mind automatically cataloguing the locations, cross-referencing them with historical data I'd memorized over years of study. Most were fringe worlds, places where the Imperial presence was light and oversight was minimal. Perfect targets for whatever conspiracy was unfolding. The sites, I said slowly, they're all from the same period. Late age of technology. Just before Old Night fell. Go on. There's something else. The spacing, the distribution, it's not random. These sites form a network. I gestured at the map, tracing invisible lines between the red dots. Look at the astronomical positioning. If you account for stellar drift over the millennia, these worlds would have been within easy warp travel of each other during the dark age of technology. Vex leaned forward slightly. The first sign of real interest I'd seen from him. A network of what? I don't know. Research stations, maybe? Communication relays? But whatever they were coordinated, working together on something. I paused, remembering the data fragments Zirian had shown me. The technology I found on Tertius 7, it wasn't just advanced, it was incomplete, like a piece of a larger puzzle. What kind of puzzle? I hesitated. What I was about to say would sound like madness, the ravings of someone who'd spent too long digging through ancient ruins and breathing recycled air. But the pattern was too clear to ignore. A weapon, I said finally. Or a tool so powerful it might as well be a weapon. Something that required multiple facilities, multiple research teams, working in perfect coordination across dozens of worlds. The silence that followed was deafening. Vex studied me with those cold eyes, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his mind, weighing my words against whatever intelligence the Inquisition had already gathered. That's quite a leap, he said eventually. Is it? Think about what happened during Old Night. Something caused the collapse of human civilization across the entire galaxy. The warp storms, yes, but what if they weren't entirely natural? What if someone or something was using technology like this to deliberately tear apart the fabric of space? You're suggesting the Age of Strife was engineered. I'm suggesting it's possible. And if that's true, then whoever's collecting these artifacts now might be trying to reassemble whatever caused it in the first place. Vex was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table's surface. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. 3 months ago, we lost contact with an entire Inquisitorial research station. 47 adepts, 17 tech marines, and an Inquisitor Lord, all investigating similar artifacts on the world of Kos Prime. When the relief expedition arrived, they found nothing but empty buildings and scorch marks that didn't match any known weapon signature. My mouth went dry. You think they found something? I think they found exactly what you're describing, a piece of the puzzle. And either it killed them all, or someone wanted us to think it had. He paused, studying my face. There's something else. The survivors from other sites, the few we've managed to recover, they all report the same thing. Dreams. Visions of vast machines buried beneath the surface of dead worlds, of equations that could reshape reality itself. Survivors? You said I was the first to survive with useful information. The others? He shook his head. Madness took them, but they all spoke of the same thing before their minds broke entirely. They called it the Terminus Engine. The name hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard it before, whispered in the deepest archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus, dismissed as legend or heretical speculation. But if it was real, if someone was trying to rebuild it, Emperor preserve us, I whispered. The Emperor helps those who help themselves, Vex replied curtly. Which brings us to why you're here instead of in a cell or a grave. We need to know everything you learned on Tertius VII, every detail, every fragment of data, every half-formed theory. Because if our enemies are as close as I think they are to completing their work, we may be running out of time to stop them. I looked at him, this hard-faced man who spoke of planetary-scale weapons and galaxy-spanning conspiracies with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. Part of me wanted to refuse, to claim ignorance, and hope they'd let me disappear into some quiet corner of the Imperium where I could forget everything I'd seen. But Xerion was dead. Whatever forces were at work had already murdered dozens, perhaps hundreds of people to keep their secret. Running wouldn't save me. And it certainly wouldn't save anyone else who might stumble onto the truth. I need guarantees, I said. You're not in a position to negotiate. I'm in the only position to negotiate. Without me, you have fragments and theories. With me, you might actually understand what you're facing. I met his gaze steadily. I want full, inquisitorial protection. Not just for me, but for anyone who helps with this investigation. No more accidents like what happened to Xerion. Vex was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Agreed. What else? Access to any other artifacts or data the Inquisition has recovered. If we're dealing with a network, I need to see the full picture to understand how the pieces fit together. That will require clearance from the Ordo Malleus. The artifacts we've recovered show signs of demonic influence. Of course they did. As if ancient superweapons weren't terrifying enough, they had to be tainted by the warp as well. But I'd come this far. There was no turning back now. I've worked with Malleus teams before. I can handle it. Very well. Vex stood, his movements precise and controlled. We'll begin immediately. But understand this. Dr. Thorne, from this moment forward, your life belongs to the Inquisition. You will go where we send you, study what we give you to study, and report everything you discover, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Is that acceptable? I thought of Xerion again, of his excitement at uncovering the mysteries of the past. He'd died because knowledge was dangerous, because some secrets were worth killing for. But secrets had power only as long as they remained hidden. Once brought into the light, they could be fought, defeated, destroyed. Yes, I said. It's acceptable. Vex nodded once, a sharp gesture that seemed to seal some invisible contract between us. Then we begin with what you found in the primary excavation site. Tell me about the chamber beneath the temple. And so I did. I told him about the crystalline formations that hummed with barely contained energy, about the hieroglyphs that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, about the central altar where something had once been mounted. something important enough that its removal had left scars in the very stone. I described the way the air itself felt charged with potential, how every instinct I possessed had screamed at me to run even as my archaeological training demanded I document everything. As I spoke, Vex occasionally interrupted with questions, probing for details I might have overlooked or dismissed as unimportant. His knowledge of ancient technology was impressive for an Inquisitor, suggesting he'd been investigating similar sites for some time. "The mounting points on the altar," he said when I finished describing the chamber. "You said there were 7? "Yes, arranged in a specific pattern, not random, but not matching any known Imperial or Xenos configurations either. We've found similar chambers on 4 other worlds. Always 7 mounting points, always the same arrangement." His expression darkened. "And always, whatever had been mounted there was gone by the time we arrived. Someone's collecting them, the components. Someone with resources, knowledge, and the ability to move freely through Imperial space without detection. That narrows the field considerably." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the interrogation chamber's temperature. "You have suspects?" "Several. None of them particularly pleasant to contemplate." Vex moved to the door, then paused. "Rest now. Tomorrow we leave for Kos Prime. You're going to examine what remains of our lost research station. And if I find what I think I'm going to find, then Emperor help us all," he replied. And for the first time since I'd met him, his voice carried something that might have been fear. The journey to Kos Prime took 3 standard days aboard the Inquisition frigate Time's inexorable truth *. I spent most of it in meditation, preparing my mind for what I might encounter. The research station had gone silent 6 months ago, a routine archaeological dig that had discovered something in the ice beneath the planet's northern pole. The last transmission had been fragmentary, desperate. The whispers, "They're in the walls. It's not human. Emperor, preserve us." Kos Prime hung before us like a frozen tomb, its surface scarred by millennia of ice storms. The research station appeared as a cluster of prefabricated modules connected by enclosed walkways, dark against the endless white. From orbit, everything looked intact. That somehow made it worse. "Minimal heat signatures," reported the frigate's captain. "Whatever happened down there, there are precious few survivors." I descended with a squad of Tempestus Scions, their hellguns ready, their movements precise despite the howling wind that threatened to knock us from our feet. The station's main entrance hung open, ice crystals coating the threshold like frozen tears. The emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow. The first body we found was in the communications room, slumped over the Vox console. Tech Adept Morvus had apparently tried to send one final message before whatever had taken his lower jaw and carved spiral patterns into his skull. The wounds were precise, ritualistic. I'd seen similar markings in the archives of the Ordo Malleus. "Chaos corruption?" asked Sergeant Corvus, his weapon trained on the shadows. "Possibly." I ran my augmetic scanner over the corpse, noting the peculiar energy readings. "But there's something else. Something older." We moved deeper into the station, following a trail of frozen blood that led toward the excavation site. More bodies lined the corridors, researchers, guards, tech priests, all bearing the same ritualistic wounds. But it was the walls that truly disturbed me. Someone had carved symbols into the metal, thousands of them, covering every available surface. They seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally, an optical illusion that made my head ache. "Sir," whispered one of the Scions. "Listen." In the distance, barely audible above the wind, came the sound of chanting, low, rhythmic, in a language that predated human civilization. My blood turned to ice as I recognized the cadence, the same rhythm I'd heard in the Manufactorum, in Mordek's final moments. The excavation chamber lay beneath the main station, accessed by a service elevator that descended into darkness. Emergency lighting had failed here, leaving only the pale glow of our lumens to push back the shadows. The dig site itself was a crater in the ice, roughly circular, perhaps 50 meters across, At its center stood something that should not have existed. It was a pillar of black stone, covered in the same writhing symbols we'd seen above. But these were not carved, they were part of the stone itself, as if the rock had been grown rather than shaped. The pillar rose 12 meters from the chamber floor, its surface reflecting our lights in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Pre-Imperial, I breathed, scanning the artifact with every augmetic sensor at my disposal. Pre-human. This thing is old beyond measure. How old? Corvus asked. 65 million years, maybe more. The chanting was louder here, echoing from the walls themselves. And there, at the base of the pillar, I could see the source 3 figures kneeling in the ice, their voices raised in that alien cadence. They had once been human, I could tell. But their transformation was nearly complete. Extra limbs sprouted from their torsos, their skin had taken on the black, oily sheen of the stone, and their eyes were windows into something vast and terrible and utterly alien. Open fire, I commanded. The Scion's hellguns lit up the chamber, las beams striking the corrupted researchers with surgical precision, but the energy simply passed through them as if they were made of shadow rather than flesh. The chanting grew louder, more urgent, and the symbols on the pillar began to pulse with an inner light. I felt it then, the presence I had sensed in the Manufactorum, but magnified 1,000-fold. It pressed against my mind like a tide of madness, whispering secrets that no human consciousness was meant to comprehend. The pillar was more than an artifact, it was an anchor, a connection point between our reality and something that existed in the spaces between thoughts. Fall back, I shouted, but it was too late. The chamber filled with that oily darkness, and within it moved shapes that violated every law of physics. They flowed like liquid, struck like lightning, and where they touched my men, the Scions simply ceased. Not killed, not destroyed, erased, as if they had never existed at all. I ran, my power armor's servos whining as I pushed the machine spirit to its limits. Behind me, the chanting reached a crescendo, and I felt reality itself begin to buckle. The elevator was too far, too slow. I activated my jump pack and rocketed upward through the shaft, praying to the Emperor that I could reach the surface before whatever was awakening in that chamber broke free. The station shook as I burst through the exit, alarms blaring as the support structure began to collapse. I didn't stop running until I reached the extraction point, where the Time's inexorable truth, shuttle waited with engines hot. What happened down there? Demanded the pilot as we lifted off. I looked back at the station, now wreathed in an unnatural darkness that seemed to drink the light from the surrounding ice. Prep the ship's main batteries. We're going to need an orbital bombardment. Sir? Target the entire northern polar region. I want cyclonic torpedoes, plasma bombardment, everything we have. Nothing can be allowed to survive down there. The bombardment lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the northern third of Kos Prime had been reduced to molten slag. I watched it all from the bridge, feeling no satisfaction, only a deep weariness. We had contained the threat, but at what cost? And more importantly, how many other sites like this existed throughout the galaxy? Vex was waiting for me when we returned to the Inquisition fortress. He took one look at my face and poured 2 glasses of Amasec without being asked. The research station? Gone. The entire excavation site. But Vex. I struggled to find the words. What we found there, it changes everything. This wasn't an isolated incident. The symbols at the Manufactorum, the corruption, it's all connected to something that's been sleeping beneath our feet for millions of years. And now, it's waking up. I nodded grimly. The question is, how many more anchor points are there? How many buried temples, hidden artifacts, forgotten excavations that might serve as conduits for this presence? Vex moved to his desk and activated a holo projector. It displayed a star chart of the sector, marked with dozens of red icons. 47 archaeological sites have gone silent in the past year. 17 manufacturing worlds have reported industrial accidents involving unexplained casualties. And these are just the ones we know about. The scope of the threat was staggering. We weren't dealing with a single corrupted individual, or even a chaos cult. This was something vast and patient, working through channels that predated human civilization. "What do you recommend?" Vex asked. I studied the star chart, noting the patterns, the connections between the affected worlds. "We need a new kind of investigation protocol. Traditional interrogation techniques won't work on subjects touched by this entity. We need to understand the nature of the corruption itself, develop countermeasures, and the psychological effects on our interrogators." That was the question I'd been dreading. I could feel it still, the alien presence that had touched my mind in that chamber. It left marks, impressions that would never fully fade. Rotation schedules. No investigator works these cases for more than 6 months. Regular psychological evaluations. And I hesitated. What? We may need to develop new techniques. The subjects aren't fully human anymore, not in any way that matters. Traditional pain, fear, even psychic domination, none of it works. But they're still connected to whatever transformed them. If we can find a way to sever that connection. Vex's expression was grim. "You're talking about creating weapons that can cut the bonds between souls and the warp itself." "I'm talking about survival. This entity, whatever it is, it's not content to remain hidden. It's actively spreading, recruiting, transforming." The corruption at the Manufactorum was just a test run. The research station was a communication node. We're looking at the early stages of a sector-wide infestation. The weight of that realization settled between us like a cold stone. The Imperium had faced chaos before, had developed strategies and countermeasures over 10 millennia of constant warfare. But this was different, older, more patient, more insidious than the obvious corruption of the ruinous powers. "How long do we have?" Vex asked. I thought of Mordek's final words, the desperate way he had clawed at his own flesh rather than speak the truths that burned in his mind. Not long. The transformation accelerates exponentially once it reaches critical mass. If my calculations are correct, we have perhaps a year before the affected worlds become completely uninhabitable. Then we'd better get started. The months that followed were a blur of investigation and horror. We developed new protocols, new techniques, new ways of fighting an enemy that existed as much in the spaces between thoughts as in physical reality. The Inquisition's chirurgeons worked with tech priests to create neural dampening fields that could temporarily sever a subject's connection to the entity. The effect lasted only minutes, but it was enough to extract vital intelligence. We learned that the corruption spread through shared knowledge that the symbols themselves were a form of psychic virus, rewriting the neural pathways of anyone who truly understood their meaning. We learned that the entity had been waiting, dormant beneath dozens of worlds, for the right combination of technological advancement and psychic resonance to begin its awakening. Most importantly, we learned its name, though speaking it aloud was forbidden except in the most secure chambers. The dreaming dark, the whisper between stars, the first shadow that fell across reality when the universe was young. The war against it would be unlike anything the Imperium had ever faced. Not a war of armies and starships, but a war of minds and souls, fought in the hidden spaces where thought and reality intersected. We would need new weapons, new soldiers, new ways of thinking about the nature of existence itself. But that is a story for another interrogation, another chamber, another desperate soul seeking answers in the darkness between the stars. For now, it is enough to know that the Inquisition endures, that we stand watch against threats both known and unknowable. In the depths of our fortress, in chambers lit by the cold glow of augmetic sensors, we continue our work. We ask our questions, we seek our truths, and sometimes, in the quiet moments between sessions, I find myself thinking of Mordek, not the twisted thing he became at the end, but the man he had been before the corruption took hold. A factory supervisor with a family, a mortgage, worries about production quotas and performance evaluations. An ordinary human being who stumbled into something vast and terrible and was consumed by it. That's what haunts me most about this war we're fighting, not the horror of the entity itself, but the realization of how fragile the barriers are between our ordered reality and the chaos that lurks just beyond perception. How easily any of us might cross that line, might find ourselves on the wrong side of an interrogation table, trying desperately to explain how the universe had suddenly revealed itself to be far stranger and more terrible than we had ever imagined. But such thoughts are a luxury I cannot afford. There is work to be done, questions to be asked, truths to be extracted from the darkness. The Emperor protects, but vigilance is the price of that protection. And in the depths of the Inquisition fortress, where the screams of the guilty echo through corridors of black stone, that vigilance continues. The interrogation never truly ends. It simply moves to the next chamber, the next subject, the next desperate search for answers, in a universe that seems determined to provide only more questions. Such is the burden of those who serve the Holy Ordos. Such is the price of standing guard against the darkness between the stars. In his name, we endure.